Hello and welcome to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast where we are taking a chronological look through the so-called Walt Disney animated classics and seeing which ones really hold up to that prestigious title on their own merits, albeit in our case, a more refined, more exclusive Waly Gisnep animated classic. As always, I am Liam and I am joined by my very good friend Ben. Ben, which film is up for consideration this time?
This week, Liam, we are looking at 2003's Brother Bear. It's a film about bears and brothers, hence the name Brother Bear. I don't know why I struggled to give a snappy one-line summary of this film. I struggled at the end of the last episode. I'm struggling at the start of this one.
This is a really interesting film because I feel that out of all of the films in this experimental post-Renaissance era, this is the one that feels like it is most trying to be a Renaissance film. That Renaissance film in particular is Tarzan, but we'll get to that.
So what's your history with this film, Liam?
This is a film that I have seen twice. Once when I was watching all of the animated classics in order, and now a second time for this podcast. So this is not a film I have any history with as a child. I think I was 13. I was too cool for Disney. I wasn't too cool for solar surfboarding Disney, but I was too cool for brothers being animals Disney.
How could you ever be too cool for something that rad? It's not possible.
So what I find most interesting about this film is probably that it's very much a product of Disney's CEO at the time, Michael Eisner. We had just had the Renaissance, and post-Renaissance, the studio was kind of a bit all over the place, but by the time this entered production, we hadn't really seen that. But alongside that experimentation, Michael Eisner said, you know what sells really well? Animal films. And what he meant was, do you know what sells really well? The Lion King. And so wanting to replicate that success of The Lion King, Michael Eisner was like, okay, story writers, give me your best pitch that will involve animals. And if you can manage it, let's do it set in North America, because I don't think we have enough films celebrating North America. From Disney, at least. I think obviously we'd had The Fox and the Hound that took advantage of that very kind of Call of the Wild aesthetic. But aside from Pocahontas, Michael Eisner didn't really feel that the Renaissance had done enough to celebrate what he saw as a really interesting setting. And to be honest, I have to agree. I think the wilds of northern North America are wonderful. I think they are ripe for a good story. And one thing that was done really well with this story is that they decided to once again focus on an indigenous people of North America. In the case of Brother Bear, they opted for a fictitious tribe, though it definitely has elements of the Inuit people across particularly Canada. Now, don't get me wrong, I would have loved to have seen an adaptation of an actual story from an indigenous people involved with indigenous storytellers, but if the choice is between this and the quite awkwardly handled situation we had in Pocahontas, I think it's better to hedge your bets with this rather than changing actual history and bastardizing it to tell a story that is not yours to tell.
Yeah, this very much feels like a side project kind of film. The directing duo, Aaron Blaise and Robert Walker, mostly having worked in less senior roles on Disney Renaissance films, which again, you can see that influence. And yeah, much lower budget than other films going on at the moment. It's had about a third of the budget of Treasure Planet and made about twice as much money, so did surprisingly well. Hence why this one got a straight-to-video sequel and Treasure Planet didn't.
One thing I enjoy is that going into this film for the first time, I thought, okay, we're 8 years on from Pocahontas. Maybe this film will be handled with maybe a bit more reverence for Indigenous people than that one was. But don't worry, the protagonist spends most of the film as an animal, as is a trend that is going to become increasingly common.
Let's dive into the plot then of Brother Bear. So this film is primarily told in flashback. We get one of 3 brothers telling the story of themselves, basically, and 2 of the brothers, 2 members of this tribe. We established that this is post-Ice Age, but this is obviously still a very early human settlement.
You know, I'm not sure if I like that the narrator explicitly said that this is a story about him and his brothers. Don't get me wrong, I don't necessarily prefer the reveal at the end of, and that man was me and my brothers. But by immediately saying this is my story, it kind of lessens his whole character arc in the middle. And I know that as an audience, we know that Denahi's not going to be a revenge-driven monster at the end of the film. But the children he's telling this story to are like, but you're not a revenge-driven monster. And he's like, shush, I'm telling the story about my bear brother. My brother bear, rather.
Yeah, it's a slightly awkward framing device. As is often the case with these sorts of things, I always think, does it add anything? Because if this story was it just happened, and it's not that we keep cutting back to this, or that there's a big payoff at the end. It's just, oh, and at the end it's this, it doesn't add anything. Compare it to the salesman in Aladdin, who we kind of use it to establish the tone, and then we drop it. We don't come back to it because it wouldn't add anything going back to it at the end. I don't really get the benefit of it.
The benefit is that we learn that this is the generation specifically responsible for hunting the mammoth to extinction.
What a great way to establish your characters as likeable. I've just got a note here, and this is actually before the film even starts. I mentioned on our Treasure Planet podcast that I had to turn the sound up on my TV to basically maximum, and I forgot to turn it down going into this film, and the first thing you get is the deafening THX jingle. The one that just goes up and up in volume, and it almost deafened me. So
we've got our narrator who pitches the story of a tale of 3 brothers and 1 boy who desperately wanted to be a man. And at this point, he immediately starts singing in the voice of Tina Turner. I assume that's the case, right? If he's telling this story, because the music is non-diegetic, it's not happening in the story, but it's happening for the audience. Well, we'll get to that later on, because there's some weird decisions that are made in this film in terms of music. But yeah, we get Tina Turner blasting out a song. Talking of the music, I'm just going to say, with the exception of maybe one, I don't think any of these songs are as memorable or as emotionally resonant as any of the ones that were in Tarzan for me. And I suppose it's important to note that we do have Phil Collins once again at the helm, songwriting and for the most part performing the songs. Now, if you remember in our Tarzan episode, I said, I don't care for Phil Collins. I know people like the Tarzan soundtrack, but to me, it just grates. Now, very few people like the Brother Bear soundtrack, which is considered an inferior version of the Tarzan soundtrack, so I'm sure you can imagine how I feel about it. One thing I immediately prefer in Tarzan, and in many ways I can't really believe I'm saying this, but in Tarzan the songs are more thematic and symbolic. They're not like in a traditional musical where the lyrics are reflecting either what is happening or a character's emotion. They're more just kind of pop songs that go over it in the form of montages. And I think that the decision worked quite well in Tarzan. Here, I feel that the songs were written after seeing the script, and it's very, very specific to the story. We have at one point Tina Turner singing about 3 brothers bonded by love, and I'm just thinking that's the type of specific lyric that would be more appropriate in a traditional musical than what they're actually going for, and I find that quite jarring. When that line came in, I was genuinely thinking, are they playing the film to Tina Turner in a sound booth and she's just singing whatever she sees? There's a mountain and a priestess woman, she's doing a ritual with a little bear totem. So as with any montage, this opening sequence has a purpose, and the purpose this montage serves is to tell us that our protagonist, Kenai, is a brat. His 2 older brothers seem to be very happy and dutiful in their roles within the tribe, whereas Kenai is more bothered about just having fun and basically being a nuisance, really. Is this the first Disney film where we have a significant brother-based relationship? Now, I can't remember if it is, but I assume it must be since no other Disney film has the word brother in its title. Let me just check. Snow White and the 7 Brothers? Nope. No, you're right. No, brother doesn't appear in the title of any films. There's maybe Peter Pan, but I find that the brothers are very secondary to their relationship with Wendy. And that really is the closest one I can think of. So yeah, it probably is the first significant example. Now, I don't know how you feel about the
the sort of opening 20 minutes or so of this film. We have our three brothers, Kenai the brat, Denahi the middle brother, and their oldest brother Sitka, and we establish a bit about the culture of this tribe, where they believe everyone has an animal that represents them and an aspect of their personality.
I really like this totem setup. I think it's a very efficient way of giving a character a trait, but really it's not about who they are, it's more what they should strive to be and what the spirits have guided them as this is your strength. It's not necessarily who you are at the start of your journey to adulthood, because this is very much a coming of age story. So we have this setup where Sitka, the oldest brother, his totem is the eagle of guidance. Denahi, I believe his is a totem of wisdom. Might be a fish. The wolf of wisdom. There we go. And so Kenai is really excited to find out what his totem is and what type of man he is going to be. And I love this as a setup.
I certainly like the culture aspect. Again, I don't think it's going for any specific culture, but I think it's going for more sort of what we know of cultures of the time, which I think is an interesting approach. And from a narrative perspective, again, I think we get some nice characterization there. Again, these brothers initially seem quite indistinct from each other. They just seem like generic brothers who are just horrible to each other because yay, toxic masculinity. But then Kenai gets told that he's got the Bear of Love, which does sound like a 70s disco song. And in true Captain Planet style, he's told that love is the most powerful one of all, and obviously he doesn't think that at all. Now, my general feeling about most of this first act, and we've got a little bit more to go, is that I think it's consistently slightly boring.
I would say that that is fair. I think whilst the ideas are strong, it's not particularly interesting or engaging, but at the same time, I don't necessarily want them to throw in these ridiculous action set pieces or solar surfing in an attempt to keep my interest. I'd rather they focus on the characters, and I think they do that quite well. I really like Kenai's reaction to finding out that his totem is the Bear of Love. I'm just picturing the Hair Bear bunch. Maybe Baloo is the Bear of Love. The Bear of Love would definitely be voiced by Phil Harris, at least.
I think Baloo's the bear of swinging and oafishness, but...
But I really like Kenai's reaction. He's not only disappointed, he's also kind of disgusted. He thinks that it's a weak totem and it's not a manly totem. Like you say, there's a lot of toxic masculinity being dealt with here. And we see Denahi reacting in a similar way, mocking his brother, but it's not in any kind of serious way. In a way, it feels more like he's seeing that his brother is upset by this and he's playing on that. But there's the tropes of considering it a kind of, I think they even refer to it as a sissy totem at one point. I might be wrong there. I do apologise if that's not the case, but that seems to be burnt into my mind there. But Sitka, being someone who has lived by guidance, explains that the totem's not necessarily what you think it is. It's when you take the time and really think about what it could mean, it applies to lots of different things, and even if you don't think it suits you, the shaman knows what she is doing, and you just have to trust it and give it a shot. But Kenai's not having any of it. He is disappointed that he didn't get the lion of being a muscular dude or whatever.
He was really holding out to get the Chad of awesomeness.
Speaking of, I enjoy that the Shaman Woman, who, I don't know if she gave herself a totem, but it's kind of implied when she says that she's guided by beauty. And I'm just like, that would be like me getting to choose and be like, this is the crocodile of having a big dick.
It's like when you're a kid and you just make up whatever, and it's like, oh, I got the thing of beauty. Oh, also it lets me fly. Like, just changing the rules.
I realise that she might have not given herself her totem, but whoever gave her her totem is dead and she's the shaman now, so wherever she says goes.
It used to be the heron of murdering the shaman, but now it's the heron of beauty. Don't ask what happened to the last shaman. I agree with what you were saying about not wanting sort of wacky humour. I think what this opening lacks is fun. Right? I don't feel I'm having any fun with these characters, but I don't think that's intrinsically a bad thing. I think it would work if there was a focus on how raw and difficult it is to survive in this world. Because let's remember, these are people who've barely invented fire, right? They hunt with sharpened rocks. This is a difficult world to live in, and an incredibly cold one to live in, quite literally as well as figuratively. So I think if we got a really stark opening of the three of them desperately trying to gather enough food or some resources, or just the intensity of living in nature first and foremost, and that they see nature as an enemy and something to be conquered first and foremost, then I think it sets up the second half of the film, and also it works better without us feeling like we're missing some of these characters, because they're making jokes and having hijinks with each other, but it's just not fun or funny as an audience.
You know, that would work really well, because the opening montage is the brothers collecting resources, but it is just the brothers, it's not the wider tribe. And it culminates with them securing a basket of fish. Securing fish and putting it in a basket. They didn't just happen across a basket of fish. This isn't Zelda. And then they have to rush off to the totem ceremony, and because Kenai is so excited, when he sees that he hasn't secured the fish properly, he just basically says, whatever, it'll be fine, I'll come back later and do it. Whereas if we had seen something earlier that was all about the fact that survival is on a knife edge here, it really sells that point that Kenai doesn't care about anyone other than himself, which is a much better setup to his character. So yeah, I kind of agree that that's probably something we're missing in this opening sequence. I'm not sure how Tina Turner would have sang over it, but it would have been fun to see.
I mean, the simple answer is you don't have Tina Turner sing over it. You just have an intense...
No, Ben, that was non-negotiable. Michael Eisner had 3 points. Set in North America, involves animals, and Tina Turner has to sing over it.
I guess a good comparison point, and it's not even a film I particularly love, but the opening of The Fox and the Hound is incredibly intense and minimalist, but it tells us what the relationship between nature and humanity is and the danger of that. Also, during this sequence, we kind of get what Kenai's main goal is, which he wants to put a print of his hand on the wall of his ancestors, which is the sign that you've become a man.
Which kind of gets to the heart of Kenai's character arc, really, which is that he cares more about having achieved adulthood than what it means to be an adult, which is a surprisingly complex issue for the film to be dealing with. Like, I think Disney deals with some really cool ideas during this era, whereas the Renaissance was very much all about identity. They went to really interesting places in the post-Renaissance era. I just don't think they handled it particularly well a lot of the time.
As you say, because of Kenai's laziness and selfishness, the basket of fish is taken by a bear, and Kenai, angry already and determined to prove his manliness, decides to go out and hunt the bear, and his brothers rush off after him. I'm sure it'll end fine.
I can't think of a Disney film that has worked quite so hard to make us dislike our protagonist in its opening act.
Not deliberately, anyway. There's lots of Disney films where I don't like the protagonists in the opening act, but that's not on purpose.
I do like this, though. I think that we see that Kenai is a hothead. He is doubly wounded from what he sees as the embarrassment of his totem. He just wants to prove himself to be a man. And even at this stage, he's not taking the responsibility. It is his fault that the fish were taken. It's not the bear's fault. A bear is just a bear.
Or is it? Is it, Liam?
Well, sometimes it has.
A surprisingly complex backstory.
And is into disco. Kenai goes out hunting this bear, then eventually comes across it, and it's terrifying. It is bestial and raw, and very much like the bear in The Fox and the Hound, actually. I think the animation on it is wonderful, and it's terrifying. And obviously, Kenai is immediately overwhelmed and realises the mistake he has made coming face to face with this bear, rather than just accepting responsibility for what he had done.
One nice touch we get in this sequence is the bear is defending itself. So it's trying to run away, and it's kind of only attacking when it's being attacked. And eventually the three brothers have to kind of team up to try and get it away from Kenai and save him. This culminates in Sitka seeing that the only way out is going to be to break the ice that he and the bear are stood on, causing them both to tumble off a cliff. The bear, after a few moments, climbs out, shakes itself off and walks off into the forest, but sadly Sitka is nowhere to be found.
I thought you were about to say, and then Sitka does the same.
Just lie about the plot of this film. You've probably not seen this film.
I think this is a really solid and tense action set piece. I think I'm happy that Disney were patient and didn't put one with absolutely no meaning or stakes in at the start. I think they could have come up with something at the start, but judging by some recent efforts like Treasure Planet, I think some of the action sequences they just put in for the sake of it, not always the best. And I think the patience is rewarded because the emotional stakes in this sequence are really interesting. We've spent some time getting to know the brothers. I think we're particularly guided to liking Sitka, and then we see him sacrifice himself for his brothers. And even still, Kenai cannot blame himself. I think in many ways he is blaming himself, but like, how do you even process that and how do you communicate that in a children's film? So instead, we just see the result of that, which is him just doubling down and being angry at the bear and blaming the bear. Denahi even says, like, I don't blame the bear. You just need to let this go.
Even though I do find the first act of this film a little dull and a bit lifeless, and there's definitely weaknesses in the rest of the film as well, I think for the most part the dialogue is fairly strong. We've got some good performances as well. Kenai is Joaquin Phoenix of all people, which is insane.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about that. I think the voice performance is actually pretty good. He was a young actor at this point, and a lot of great dramatic actors don't always shift well to voice acting. They are two very different skills, but I think he holds his own pretty well. I think he gets across the character, particularly that brattiness, really well, and the stubbornness. I think it's all there in the performance. It's just because you're doing a fictional people doesn't mean you can just cast some random white guy in your lead.
As you say then, Kenai once again goes out to hunt the bear, and once again Denahi has to chase after him, and it doesn't go much better than last time initially. Kenai just gets his ass handed to him because, unsurprisingly, he's a young man with a sharp stick fighting an actual bear. But seizing the opportunity, he manages to angle the spear just right so that when the bear leaps, it's pierced and killed. Just as a storm is building up atop the mountain they're fighting on, causing some weird stuff to happen.
So just a note for you here. In my notes, it just says, fight with bra, pretty tense.
I mean, that can be pretty tense.
I actually quite like this sequence. I think it's really quite tense. Again, it's very clear to the audience that the bear is just defending itself. The editing is cutting between Kenai getting his ass handed to him by this bear and Denahi chasing after them, trying to save him in time. Eventually culminating, as you say, in Kenai killing the bear. The aurora fills the sky, signalling the presence of the spirits, and the form of a great eagle representing Sitka comes down and picks the bear up, kind of whisking it away, and also in the process transforming Kenai. There's a little bit of body horror in it. They don't just cut away from the transformation, we see a bit of it. And I think the animation on this sequence is okay. You can definitely see that not as much of a budget has gone into this as went into, say, Treasure Planet or Atlantis. I think I compare this to the sequence in Atlantis with the Heart of Atlantis, where the masks are rotating and the lights are changing. The effort and the skill that goes into every frame on that is so obvious because they're making their job more difficult for themselves. Whereas here, there's lots of lights, but it feels very flat.
Also, there's some really wonky backgrounds in this. I don't know why it stood out so much, but they're almost as bad as some of the stuff in Blood Black Cauldron. And I don't know why, but yeah, they just gel horribly. Maybe they were doing some CGI stuff in the background and it just didn't work well.
The backgrounds are kind of weird. Obviously, we had the watercolours in Lilo and Stitch, which was quite a contrast but worked quite well. Whereas here, I think they seem to be oil paintings a lot of the time. And it is constantly drawing my eye. It's very strange.
So just as Kenai is indeed transformed into a bear, it's just when Denahi reaches the top and sees what he presumes is the bear that has killed Kenai, as there is a broken spear and the bear totem on the floor. Kenai, in shock, basically just falls off the cliff, and he's fine. So one thing we've established earlier in this film is bears can fall off cliffs with no ill effects, unlike dinosaurs.
That is a very good point, actually. Though maybe if there was a body of water underneath the dinosaurs, they would have been fine. They fall off cliffs all the time. I was like, oops.
As far as I remember, there may well be water in that film. Actually, there is, because when Aladar jumps off a cliff at the start of the film, it's into the sea and he's fine. God, let's stop talking about dinosaur.
Now, this is probably the first part of the film that actively bugs me, and that is now the change in Denahi's character. He did not blame the bear for Sitka's death. He understood that Sitka sacrificed himself to save them, and he only had to do so because of the actions of Kenai. And now, Kenai has recklessly gone off and got himself eaten by a bear, and suddenly Denahi is like, yep, I'm going to take on my brother's quest and get revenge against this bear, which I know is an innocent party in this whole affair. It's just very strange to me. And again, doubly so because the narrator is Denahi, and we know that he's not going to be that at the end.
So I think what this is meant to be is a couple of things. One is that Denahi's gone from losing something very important to losing everything when he's lost his second brother. And I think he's a lot more protective of Kenai than Sitka because he was Sitka's younger brother. I also think this is meant to be almost the fork in the road for Kenai. So Denahi represents the road Kenai would have carried on going down if there hadn't been this spiritual intervention and this metamorphosis. That's my read of it, but I'd agree that it's not done amazingly smoothly. I suppose one thing I like, again, it's just done visually. You know, Denahi doesn't say to himself, I'm going to kill that bear. Or we don't get a narration saying, and anger filled my heart. We just get Denahi pick up the spear, tie the bear totem around the end of it, and we very clearly can see what that means.
I do wish he had thrown aside the wolf of wisdom and picked up the squirrel of revenge, though.
Following this, we get quite a weird scene in the film. So what I was expecting at this point was, Kenai kind of discovers these things about himself, that he's now a bear and how he's going to deal with that, and he kind of has to learn about the world. But instead, he gets the shaman from the start of the film, and she kind of explains to him that he has to fix things and go and see his brother's spirit or whatever. And then she just disappears, so it's kind of implied that this is a vision he's having, and obviously that she's not really there, which I'm fine with. I just don't think the scene really adds anything, because then we have Kenai bumbling around and failing to be a bear and discovering he can talk to animals. And you could have all that and him be like, okay, I'm a bear, Sitka did this to me, I need to get back to Sitka. Where can I find him? Right, where the lights are. Like, functionally speaking, he does exactly the same thing.
One of the things that makes it even more disappointing is there is some wonderful visual representation going on in this as well. So whenever you watch this film, they change the aspect ratio at the start. It's much more closed and claustrophobic, and also the colour palette is fairly dull and cold. As soon as Kenai becomes a bear, the aspect ratio opens up to widescreen. The colour palette is a lot more warm and sort of associated with the spring flowers, and we can hear the various animals speaking. He can suddenly not only hear the nature around him, he is seeing it in a whole different way. The visual design of the film completely changes, which is so wonderful, but it's all undermined by the Shaman Woman showing up and giving Kenai a quest.
As I say, I think it's unnecessary, and it's fairly heavy-handed as well. During this sequence then, we establish that Kenai can now speak to animals, and he speaks to Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas doing Bob and Doug, which are just their comedy characters, and that's what they do in this film. And it's got nothing to do with the plot. It's just, hey, we like this double act. Let's just get them to do that in a film playing some moose.
Don't get me wrong. I'm sure in Canada, Bob and Doug McKenzie are cultural icons. So if you're going to have a film set in Canada, you're like, hey, we could include Bob and Doug McKenzie. But they weren't really that known in the United States, let alone known at all, really, to a 13-year-old boy in the United Kingdom in 2003. So that just goes straight over most of the audience's head. And you're right, it is just Bob and Doug McKenzie. Like, they're not altering the performance at all. I wonder how much of it was improv, because Bob and Doug McKenzie are improv characters. And I've got to admit, I may not find anything they do funny, but I kind of admire if it was all unscripted.
So what you're saying is, you don't care for something if it's not entertaining, but if it's not entertaining but not scripted, you like it.
No, I admire it. So weird. Bob and Doug, they show up in loads of places. I was playing Spyro recently, and there's a level where I think it's Spyro 3. There's an ice level and there's 2 polar bears in it, one called Bob and one called Doug, and they're just doing the ridiculous North Canada accents. It's just like, oh, okay. Obviously meant nothing to me as a child.
It means very little to me now.
But it meant something to Michael Eisner, and this is a film that he thought would be a smash hit and wanted to get made.
Following all this, Kenai manages to bumble into a bear trap, and we're introduced to the other bear, Coda the bear, who's a little baby bear. Liam, how do you feel about Coda?
To me, Coda is simultaneously adorable and annoying as hell.
I think that is the perfect description for this character.
Which I think is exactly what they were going for. He's supposed to be a little brother, and I'm a youngish child. I don't know what little brothers are like. But if representations in the media have taught me anything, this is the shorthand for an annoying little brother. And I think they nailed that really well. And I also think that Jeremy Suarez's performance is really good.
I think one thing that doesn't help with Coda is that the performance just sounds a lot like young Simba. And it just pulls me out of the film a little bit. But yeah, I'd agree. We established that Coda has been separated from his mum and he's trying to get to the salmon feeding ground. After some back and forth, basically, Kenai agrees to take him there provided Coda takes him to where the lights are, i.e. the Aurora Borealis, where he can see Sitka again.
It's not just after some back and forth, it's after my favourite joke that Disney do. Kenai is stuck in the trap and is explaining how it was made by humans and it'll be really complicated for the bear. Oh, and Coda has set him free. Oh, okay, good joke.
I mean, isn't that what we criticise Treasure Planet for, where it's one character saying something and then being immediately contradicted by something that happens?
That's the joke that pervades all of Disney in this era. There's at least one in every film.
Yeah. I don't know if I prefer that to Canadian comedy characters I've never heard of and don't get. Not big on either of them.
So the heart of this film is going to be the burgeoning relationship between these 2 bears, effectively. And one thing that is very obvious when you listen to it is, as is the case across animated films pretty much all the time, with a few exceptions, everything is recorded separately. And this feels like a film that really would have benefited from having Joaquin Phoenix and Jeremy Suarez in the same booth recording together. I think you would have had a lot more chemistry. And as I say, it's not a common thing. I think they did it with Mike and Sully in Monsters, Inc. But importantly, they let Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas in the same booth for this film. So they were clearly set up for that and prepared to do the editing. And I think it would have helped so much because whilst I can't say how much it would have affected the performance of Coda, Joaquin Phoenix is a pro. I think he would have greatly benefited, as it seems like I think it might be his first voice acting performance. It would have made a complete difference to his performance if he had someone there to have chemistry with and to bounce off. And I just think it's a massive shame that they didn't do it.
We do, however, get Coda doing a sort of vocal duet with someone, and that is good old Phil Collins, because at one point Coda starts singing a song called On My Way, and I'd forgotten a lot about this film, and I was thinking, oh, is there like songs in this film that the characters sing? And the answer is, no, not really. Is that Coda starts singing it as if it's going to be a big musical number, and then Phil Collins just takes over, but then Coda takes over at the end. It's a weird decision.
I just enjoy picturing Denahi telling this story, having to do different voices for Coda, and then transition into a Phil Collins voice in the middle of the song as well.
I mean, how does Denahi know that any of this happened? Because he wasn't there for it, and he never gets to speak to Kenai because Kenai gets turned into a bear. So, as far as we know, Denahi's just making this up.
I assume that at the start of this film, he has taken over the mantle of Shaman.
So he gets the title to make up bullshit, sure.
Yeah, basically. I have mixed feelings about this. I understand what you're saying, but I quite like that as a way of doing a montage of starting with a character singing and then transitioning to non-diegetic music so that you can have a montage. But you're right. The fact that it's the only time it happens is very jarring. And really, with a bit of a rejig of the storyboarding, it wouldn't really need to be a montage, or it wouldn't need to be as dramatic a montage as what we have, and you could have Coda singing over all of it. But the problem with that is we'd also have Joaquin Phoenix just telling him to shut up for the duration, which is what we get until Phil Collins kicks in. It'd be good if he started telling Phil Collins to shut up, actually.
How do I silence this ethereal British man singing. I don't know about you, Liam, but I find the middle of this film a bit light on plot because
A little bit, yeah.
And don't get me wrong, stuff happens, and in some ways, it's simultaneously the best and worst thing about this film in that it's not massively plot-driven, it is character-driven for the most part. Don't get me wrong, we get a lot of time with Bob and Doug, which I could definitely... It has nothing to do with the plot at all. But for the most part, it's just the gradual building of this relationship, and it is gradual, it isn't they hate each other, and then in the final act... they love each other. There is a genuine build-up of this.
On top of that, we have moments where the relationship suffers a bit. You know, they'll get closer and one of them will kind of push the other one away. Like, it's not a smooth road. I have to agree. I think the development of the relationship is really good. Outside of that, Ben, can you tell me one thing that happens between now and the salmon run?
Does anything with the moose count?
No, nothing with Bob and Doug.
Well, I can remember... a bit. So, like, we see Denahi getting increasingly frustrated and desperate, and a couple of times he catches up to them and they have to run away, or, you know, they have to separate themselves from him. And again, Denahi's just getting more and more lost to this vengeance and this rage. Gradually, Coda kind of becomes more vulnerable and reveals more about himself. So initially, Coda's very, very cocky, but we actually see that this is his mask for dealing with how scared and uncertain he is. So there's a couple of really nice moments with Coda where we see him go from, I've been separated from my mum, to my mum's missing. There's a bit where they find some cave paintings and we see a painting of a person with a spear fighting a bear, and they comment on how scary it looks, and Coda says, yeah, particularly when they've got sticks. And
it is a painting of a bear with sticks.
And I think it's just for me on the right side of...
on the nose.
Yeah, like, it's a little bit on the nose, but I think it's the right level for a kid's film, right? Like, there is some nuance to it. A lesser film would have just said, they're really scary, yeah, unlike us bears, or something. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think there's just some nice stuff in there.
No, I agree. I think it's one of the highlights of the film. I think the animation on Kenai's face when he hears Coda say that is really good. It tells us a lot without actually having to tell us a lot, which a lesser film, as you say, would have done. There are some nice moments in this. There's a part where Coda talks about the spirits when looking at the aurora, and that's a really nice way of saying that we're all part of the same nature without explicitly saying that. I think there is a lot that's done really well in this second act. And yeah, it's mostly character driven. There's a few action set pieces I don't particularly like them. There's one where they have to run across a field of geysers, I think, and they're being chased by Denahi, who at the end, in just an incredible feat of strength, lifts a log that a bear is on. And like, that's like a mother lifting a car to rescue an infant. This is a revenge-driven brother lifting a log with a bear on it. It doesn't quite have the same ring, but it's the same level of superhuman strength.
It was at this point in the film where it made me think a little bit about the way this film's marketed. So, in the DVD collection I have, because I always watch these on DVD, you get to see the original release poster. And this is very much in the era of Disney where they didn't have a clue how to market these films. This film has a terrible poster, so it's a really weird, dark in terms of contrast image of Kenai as a bear and Coda kind of looking at each other and smirking, and the tagline is "Nature Calls," which I don't think really has any meaning and doesn't communicate the tone of this film very well. Given what it's, I feel a much better tagline would have been 3 brothers, 1 death wish, because they all want to die at the hand of a bear.
But that kind of suggests that it somehow involves
Charles Bronson?
I can immediately picture a better poster though, which is in the style of those minimalist Renaissance posters. Have it black, but the light, like the lit up part, just be a firelight lighting up the wall of hands. Maybe with some other images, but I think just that big wall of hands with maybe like the human form of Kenai silhouetted, I think would be a really good Renaissance style poster. Not this 2 bears kind of smirking at each other nonsense.
Speaking of bears smirking at each other, eventually we do reach the salmon run that the bears do, which is based on what bears really do. Like, they go to where the salmon are swimming upstream and they just eat them all. And this, I'd say, is one of the stupidest things I've ever seen put to screen.
It starts off really well for me. I really enjoy that the introduction to the salmon run is Kenai rushing into the water, then realizing he's surrounded by bears who his human brain is telling him are incredibly dangerous, and he just screams, and then it does the kind of hard cut to reality of all of these bears looking on at another bear just screaming, and they laugh at him. I think it's a really nice little beat at the start of this scene, but yeah, it's all just downhill from there.
So basically what we get is this weird montage of bears just being happy, being bears, and we've got a bad Phil Collins song playing over the top of it. And I know what the function of this scene is, right? It's to be like, hey, look, bears have society too. But A, the parallel's pretty bad because this isn't how we had human society presented to us. Human society wasn't presented to us as fun. It was presented as serious. So having bears be ridiculously happy feels too jarring.
Which is more jarring, this musical sequence or the musical sequence, bears like to say it with a slap, from Bongo? Alternatively, we can put that song over this sequence.
Well, I'd say this is more jarring because my emotional reaction to the rest of Bongo up to that point was the same as before, during, and after that song. So that song had no bearing on my enjoyment of that film. Whereas this, I was like, okay, this is quite serious to this is silly. It feels like the worst example, almost a parody of here's a happy animated sequence from a film. It's just, I don't know, something about the tone's just off and it just doesn't work.
This is one of those moments where we criticise films where they feel like they're made by executives for an audience they don't understand. And I don't feel the creators of this film thought this was a big, happy and emotional scene. They were just like, we need this scene in the film. I think kids will like it. So well done, Phil. You're done for the day. Bye. They got Phil Collins to do all the animation too, it seems.
But he looks like it. You're right. This is a scene where they've gone, we need something that functionally shows this. And the message is kind of, it's the broad underlying message of this film, which I genuinely like, which is, animals are people too. Except salmon, obviously. Screw salmon. We'll just kill them and eat them all the time. That's fine. We don't like salmon.
Yeah, why don't we hear the salmon screaming? We do actually hear seagulls or some kind of gull screaming on the way in, which makes me wonder, was this before or after Finding Nemo?
It was around the same time because... So this is slightly tangential, but I feel it's something I need to talk about at some point. So the Academy Awards introduced the Best Animated Feature section because basically there were lots of good animated films being made by Pixar, and they felt they needed a separate category for it because they didn't feel they really stood a chance against the other films. And basically, to a certain degree, that's true. Beauty and the Beast was the only animated film to ever get into that category prior to that point. But they weren't really looking very far afield for animated films, so the same year that this came out, it was nominated for Best Animated Picture, despite the fact it got bad reviews. Finding Nemo is the film that beat it, and there was only one other film in the category because they were like, oh, we've committed to doing this category now, let's find some animated films. It's like, there's like Best Original Song, but imagine if only 4 films every year had a song in them. So you just have to put them in de facto.
Speaking of, was Welcome to Our Family nominated?
Let me just check. No. I didn't have to check, by the way.
This all culminates in a very simple yet strange game that the bears play, where they throw a fish around to each other. Again, this is a living creature, and they can all understand animals, so remember this is screaming the whole time. And whoever catches the fish has to tell the story of the most interesting thing that happened to them this year. Which, I'm not expecting bears to be playing football, but they meet up once a year and this is the game they play.
You say that, Liam, but as someone who's seen people for the first time post-lockdown, that is genuinely the conversations I've been having, is, what's the most interesting thing you've done in the last year? Well, not much.
In fact, now I think about it, the bears' stories are far more interesting than anything I will be able to tell if I was playing that game this year, actually. Because it's quite a nice little joke. The bears don't live particularly interesting lives. Their lives are basically just survival. I think the Michael Clark Duncan bear, his story is that he knocked down a tree and now there are some squirrels living with him, which also they came with him, which is interesting.
That's how it works. If you destroy someone's house, They have to be with you at all times.
But then the salmon is thrown and Kenai catches it, and he has to tell the most interesting thing that happened to him, which is that he met Coda, and it's a really nice, sweet little speech.
It was either that or he said, "Oh, I got my brother killed, then killed a bear," which, given that he's among bears, probably wouldn't have gone down amazingly well.
It's at this point that Kenai throws the salmon to Coda, who has excitedly been waiting for his turn, and he starts telling the story about how he was separated from his mother and she was protecting him from one of the monsters with the sticks, and eventually saw her fall off a collapsing glacier and survive, and that he hasn't been able to meet up with her since. And it's at this point that Kenai realizes that he is the monster, he is the hunter that has killed Coda's mother. I will say, I think this is done really well throughout the film up to this point. We're not hit over the head with the fact that Kenai is responsible for Coda being separated from his mother. I think most audiences will presume that is the case because there's not particularly many characters, but we're not being hammered with it constantly. We're not having Coda say, "I wonder where my mother is." He references that he's looking forward to seeing her again at the salmon run, but it's not constantly there. It's just in the background. However, during this scene, I think they make a mistake of cutting to the sequences that we've seen earlier. I think we know what's going on, and I think the most interesting way of doing this would be having Coda tell the story, and it cut between Coda telling it and showing his excited face, and Kenai having the look of shock and understanding on his face, rather than showing us the sequences that we'd already seen. Or, if you have to show the sequences, show them all from the new perspective we have with these cartoon bears. We see one scene, which is Coda in the bushes and his mother telling him to stay back, but outside of that, it's all animated footage we've seen before.
And I think that's absolutely the way it could have worked, because, you know, we see Kenai and Denahi looking over the cliff for Sitka, but seeing that from the perspective of a scared young bear, seeing these two men towering over this cliff with these deadly weapons, it is very different. And so yeah, I absolutely think having the visual of that would have been a better angle to go for. And speaking of weird decisions that were made regarding this revelation, so Kenai runs off and Coda runs after him, and Kenai realises he's going to have to tell Coda the truth. Now he's realised it himself. And we gear up for what's going to be basically the emotional centrepiece of this film. You know, we know this is going to be an incredibly difficult conversation for these two characters to have. You know, there's no easy way of them having this conversation. Kenai sits Coda down and he says, "This is about a man and a monster." And I was like, and now here's Clopan to explain what happens, because that's his specialty. But instead, they start talking, and there's a line I really, really like where Kenai says, "Okay, let me tell you a story." And then when it starts going into this direction, Coda says, "I don't like this story." And he gets visibly scared. And that is a moment when you go, this character is a child, and they cannot deal with this. Unfortunately, I think some of it is lost, because whilst this conversation starts happening, we lose most of the audio of their conversation, instead get a Phil Collins song.
My opinion on this changes almost every time I think about it, because in many ways I am a fan of leaving the horrifying and the unimaginable to the audience. I think of cosmic horror where it doesn't adapt well to film because it's supposed to be beyond comprehension. That works really well in the written word. As soon as you put it to the screen, it's comprehensible. And I think similarly, this is something that works very well in literature. It reminds me of when a character curses and it allows the reader to fill it in with the worst word they can imagine, rather than telling us that, you know, Long John Silver said cunt flaps or whatever.
Yeah, I'm really glad Robert Louis Stevenson changed that for the final version of the book.
And similarly, here, this is such a difficult conversation that I kind of like that we just get these beats of the conversation and are then allowed to imagine how difficult it is ourselves. Like you say, the core things are there, the setup. This is a story about a man and a monster. I don't like this story. Kenai then saying, "I did something terrible," and we see Coda reacting. I actually think the scene can work really well. I don't think the song fits with it at all. Do you think it's possible to have the disjointed scene without a song, or would you just prefer them to put to the script the actual conversation that these characters have?
I think if they were going down that route of, we only want to have the beats of this conversation, I would see it like this. So I suppose this is going back to my suggestion for the opening act of this film, which, if you don't go down the route of making it more fun and funny, you go, this is an intense, inhospitable place to live, and survival comes first, which kind of sets up a lot of the other stuff in this film. I would then have maybe some very simple music, but then the sounds of the environment, so the wind howling, the snow falling, all that sort of stuff, and, say that these characters are connected with nature, because I think that's what a lot of this film is about, is that our humanity and the natural world are intrinsically linked. So I think that would be a route to go down. I think it's just a shame, really, because as I say, I think for the most part, the serious dialogue, the character-driven dialogue in this film is strong, so I'm confident they could have written a strong version of this scene. That's how I feel about it.
Really, though, the biggest problem in this is that the song Phil Collins sings contains the line, "Brother Bear, I let you down." Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear the title of a film said in the film, I have the overwhelming instinct to just go, hey, which means over this very, very serious moment, that happened.
I think it depends on the name of the film. I don't have a problem with the word Tarzan being used a lot in the film Tarzan, because, hey, that's the character's name.
No,
if at the end
throughout the entirety of Tarzan, every other line I was going, hey.
But it certainly would be jarring if, after 90 minutes of intense character-driven stuff, someone said, he really was the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I don't think they say the word dinosaur in dinosaur at all.
I have no energy to cheer during that film. One thing I do like about this scene, though, is that it ends unresolved. Often getting something off your conscience might be the best thing for you, but it's not necessarily the best thing for someone else. And Coda has just found out that not only is his mum dead, but that the person he has grown so attached to is the one responsible. Obviously, he runs away. He's scared, he's upset, and he doesn't know how to process this. He is a child.
And again, I think this final act is where we get some of the best stuff in this film. As I say, I think the first act is quite dull. The middle act is a bit insubstantial, but I think this is strong. And again, make a comparison point to The Lion King, where Simba gets vindicated. You didn't kill Mufasa, I did. Here we get, you didn't just kill a bear, you killed the most important bear to me, my mother. And that's it. There's no, oh, actually, it wasn't quite how it seems, or the mum's okay. No, she's dead, you did that, and you have to deal with the consequences of it, which is powerful.
It's arguably the darkest Disney has ever gone with a protagonist. I mean, outside of Mulan and her 5,000 body count, but that's war. This is cold-blooded murder on a completely innocent creature, and then we have to see the consequences of that. I think this is really great. Not cold-blooded murder, just how this story is told.
Cold-blooded murder is, let's be honest, a mixed bag.
So we're well and truly into our final act now, and Coda is now at his low point, where he's completely alone and distraught, he's upset. But don't worry, that won't last long, because to save him, our old friends, Bob and Doug McDearsy, come along and have a nice conversation about how much they love each other as brothers, making Coda realise that, I guess everything is okay. I like the speech. I think it could have been better, and it definitely could have been better if done by, let's say, some of the bears.
Or if it was just like, man, if I had a brother, I wouldn't have to put up with these two moose. I guess I'll forgive him for killing my mum.
Man, if I had a brother, I could get him to beat up the guy who killed my mum.
With his brother bare hands.
Yay. And so we're now truly at the climax of the film. Kenai, having cleared his conscience, but feeling no better, and in many ways, like, not understanding what this has achieved, finally reaches the mountain where the earth touches the sky and the spirits are there, and he's appealing to his brother, what do I do? But before he can get any kind of response from Sitka, he is ambushed by Denahi, echoing the moment where Kenai attacked and killed Coda's mother.
And again, what's nice about this is, obviously Kenai doesn't want to do any harm to Denahi, but also he's got to try and not die and not let either of them be harmed, which obviously is proving incredibly difficult. At the climax of the fight, when Denahi's about to land the final blow, Coda comes in and interrupts and steals the spear, and that sort of brotherly bond is reignited.
This is really interesting, and I don't think it's quite communicating what it's supposed to be doing, because Coda is saving Kenai, but in doing so attracts the attention of Denahi, who goes after Coda. But I never really feel that Denahi's going to kill Coda. As far as his understanding, these two bears are related, and obviously the bigger one is going to protect the smaller one. But Denahi goes after Coda, and it's at this point that Kenai realises he has to stop Denahi. And I think he actually attacks him to protect Coda. And it's at this moment that when Denahi turns around with the spear echoing how Kenai killed the original bear, the spirits intervene and Kenai is transformed back into his human form. And I'm not quite sure what they're going for here, because what he has not learnt, and this is kind of my problem overall with his character arc, is that he's not learnt love. He's learned not to be selfish, which I suppose is love. And it's this specific act of sacrifice to save Coda, potentially killing himself, that saves him. And I just think it's much messier. Weirdly enough, they do this exact kind of sibling relationship perfectly in a film that's coming up in the not too distant future. But here it's just so messy.
I get what you're saying. I think there's meant to be a couple of parallels here. So the obvious one is this is meant to be paralleling what Sitka does at the start of the film, where he sees sacrifice as the only way to save the brothers he has. And I think that's what this is meant to be. But also Coda is, rather than destroying something in revenge for having lost something, he's focusing on what he's still got, which in this case is Coda. So I think that's what it's meant to be about. We do have a genuinely powerful moment coming up, though, where Kenai has learned to love his brothers, both his human and bear brother, and he's learned what's truly important. But I don't think the sacrifice is actually the true key moment for Kenai, because he looks at Coda, who's confused and scared by his bear brother, his brother bear, if you will, having been turned into a human, and he realises that the only way to atone for what he's done is to go back to that being that brotherly role. And genuinely, that wasn't what I was expecting to happen in this film. I expected there to be some resolution and some nice stuff, and, you know, he earns his humanity back and everything's fine. But no, it's not fine. He has to go back and fix it. And that's genuinely really good. I
love this ending. I think there's a wonderful moment where Coda is scared and then he realises what's going on, and human Kenai and Coda hug, and it moves me every time. And it's at this point that, as you say, Kenai turns to Sitka and says, he needs me, and decides that he's going to live as a bear. It's a wonderful resolution for his character arc. The route there might be a little bit messy, and I still don't quite understand the resolution of his transformation. The transformation, by the way, a little bit weird. It's not Cronenberg levels, but it's kind of freaky for a children's film.
Also in this sequence, a really nice little moment is Coda gets a moment with the spirit of his mother, and they get to say goodbye, which again is just really moving. And I think it's a testament to the good parts of this film that the emotional climax is someone saying, I need to be turned into a bear. Because that is inherently ridiculous, but this film makes you get the emotional buy-in. The one thing I thought watching it this time round was, couldn't you just turn Coda into a human? Wouldn't that fix every problem?
But I feel we're getting into the Chip Borner Cup territory again, where how do you cope after so long as a bear and not knowing humanity?
Well, Kenai managed it in like a couple of days. He went from being a human to a bear.
But he's also the one making that sacrifice. Asking Coda to upend his life because Kenai killed his mum is quite an ask, really.
I'll just turn everyone into bears then.
Or turn all the bears into humans. And that's why there are no more bears.
Only joking. Humans killed them all.
And on top of all of this, we've got a proper trifecta of emotional beats here. We've got Kenai deciding to become a bear. We've got Coda's farewell with his mum, which, as you say, it's genuinely moving. It gets me every time. A lot of it is the animation and the score, and I'm not sure necessarily how earned it is, because it's clearly very emotionally manipulative, but I'm quite happy to be manipulated in that way, because it's genuinely quite lovely. But then to top it all off, we go back to the narration, and we're told by Denahi how his brother taught him that love really is the most powerful force of all, and that is the story of his brother who became a man by becoming a bear. And then we return to the tribe and the ceremony with the hands on the walls, where we see the people part and Kenai appears and places his paw print in the centre of the wall, and it's genuinely beautiful.
It's really nice. Like, again, I think it's a bit weird. So I think one of the ways they manage the bear transformation stuff quite well is because it's quite spiritual and removed. But then when you just have a fully grown bear wandering into the tribe, like, it raises a lot of questions. But yeah, I can't deny visually it's a very strong moment. And again, as you know, if you listen to this podcast, I like visual characterization and storytelling. And they kind of do both here, where they have that line about becoming a man by becoming a bear. They obviously wrote them like, that's pretty good, we've got to keep that in. But then the paw print says it all. And yeah, and then that's how we end the film.
Imagine if they turned Coda into a human instead. That line would be, who became a man by turning a bear into a boy.
Like, sorry, what is the moral of this story, Denai? You've really confused us. Well, if you found that confusing, I've got some side bits that are going to go over the end credits that are weird side jokes which we've sort of taken from Pixar and don't really work.
What an era of animation we're in, where this is how you end your film. We haven't fully decided that every film has to end in a dance party. Many, taking a leaf out of Pixar's bloopers book, would just have like random little tidbits at the end. Which, did you watch all of them?
I think so. The last one I got was the Misshapen Bear. Is that...
Yes, there's a bear who... So the joke is that, and it happens earlier in the film, but Coda and Kenai are moving about behind some glaciers, and it has an effect of kind of a hall of mirror where it will distort their faces and they're laughing. And then a third bear joins them who is also laughing behind the glacier. But as they move, like, the bear just looks like that. And it's genuinely weird, and their reaction to it is quite disturbed.
Yeah, it's a bear that's like, it's got one eye like way bigger than the other and its head's as big as its body. And you're just like, huh. They kind of, again, they wanted to have their cake and eat it because they wrote that and were like, oh, this is too weird to put in this film. And then they were like, let's put it in anyway. We'll put it at the end and then we can just sort of say it's not canon but is canon. Yeah, weird decision.
Well, you say that, but that character is who the sequel is about.
Okay, before we wrap up and make a couple of key decisions here, I need to talk about Brother Bear 2. Now, I've never seen Brother Bear 2. I don't know anything about it.
Don't worry, I don't think anyone has seen Brother Bear 2.
But on some of the DVDs, there is a trailer for Brother Bear 2. And I swear to God, this is what the trailer is. It's Bob and Doug talking about Brother Bear 2. And I can't remember exactly, it's something like, oh, do you remember those bears? Whatever. All the trailer for Brother Bear 2 is shots of Bob and Doug from Brother Bear 1. So there's no footage of Brother Bear 2 in the trailer, it's just footage of Brother Bear 1. It's the laziest, worst trailer I've ever seen.
Ben, straight-to-DVD sequels are expensive. You've got to cut costs somewhere.
Now, they are not expensive. Okay, anyway, that's enough about Brother Bear 2. We're talking about Brother Bear 1. So, Liam, before you and I decide whether Brother Bear is worthy of going on our list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, is there anything else we need to talk about regarding this film?
There is just one thing. As always, we need to decide which character in Brother Bear we think is the sexiest. Once again, we are talking about the character who we feel is the most unnecessarily sexualized for an animated family film. Now, as I alluded to at the start, this is one of the films in the Disney canon where a protagonist of colour spends the majority of the film as an animal. And really, as a result, there's not particularly many human characters, so I have a feeling that our choice is once again going to be an animal. And whilst it might not be a sexy dog, Ben, who is the sexiest character in Brother Bear, and why is it Tug, the Michael Clark Duncan beefcake of a bear?
You've kind of caught me off guard with this one because I didn't actually think of any characters for this film, so I was just kind of scanning through my head. It's not the choice I'd have gone for, to be honest. I think that probably the closest one is Sitka, who's sort of quite rugged and he's got a certain, masculine handsomeness to him. I don't know if I'd just go for a big fat beefcake bear. One of the reasons that character doesn't seem very sexy to me is he's weirdly nosy, and he's like, yeah, where are you from again? What? Tell me. And I'm just like, just mind your own business. Like,
I'd probably have to agree with Sitka. I think Sitka has this really attractive masculine quality to him that comes with his calmness and his wisdom. But once again, like, this is a character who spends most of the film as a representation of an eagle, really. There's also, I suppose, the shaman who says herself that her totem is beauty. She didn't specifically say that it was the anthropomorphic fox of sexiness, but it's close enough.
And it's just a little Robin Hood totem she's got.
Denahi, why are you telling us this story about sexy foxes?
Denahi, the production values of this story just seem really forced compared to other stories. Did you not have a lot of money for this one?
This looks just like the story you told us last week. Before we can decide whether or not Brother Bear deserves a place on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, first we need to retrieve the scroll itself. Ben, if you could do the honours.
Thank you, Liam. As I approach the vault, I can see there are some priceless ancient cave paintings on this wall depicting the main emotional and comedic beats of Brother Bear. I'll just get those scrubbed off real quick. Don't want any mess on the vault. And as I open it up, I retrieve the hallowed list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. So I take out my quill. Liam, should I write Brother Bear on this list?
I want to start off by saying I definitely think this is an improvement over how Pocahontas was handled. It's not without its problems. As I say, it's a fictional people and a fictional story, which means it's not really bastardizing history or manipulating any particular culture, but that's still there by not giving the platform to the people with a story to tell. This is no Moana, definitely not, but it's a step up from Pocahontas. And I really admire the core character arc of Kenai. The only problem I really have with that is I don't really feel that love plays much of a part in it. I feel that what we have is learning to put your needs second. Basically, that's his character arc, and it's being mature, and he goes from being the younger sibling who is a brat to having to be an older sibling who can guide the way for someone else. And I understand that that is love, but I also feel that they chose love because it is a marketable and simple word that people can remember for really what is quite a complicated issue. But I love that they're dealing with this complicated issue. It's the same thing I love about Lilo and Stitch. We're looking at really interesting relationships that are more than just, I want feet. Little Mermaid.
So I spent too long on the internet. That phrase has a very different meaning.
That said, whilst I think the core message is strong but messy, all the emotional beats are really strong. But everything between the emotional beats, I kind of just turn off between. I think the few action sequences we have are well tied to those emotional beats. I think we're not hit over the head with the eventual reveal, though I feel, again, most audiences are going to understand what's happening and what's going to happen. But in between, I just feel that I'm looking for more. This is a really tough one for me because the things I like in this film, I really, really like. But everything else, I have no feelings for whatsoever. I think I'm going to say it doesn't quite do enough to make the list for me. And I feel I may have been pushed over the edge by just one too many Phil Collins songs.
Like so many people before you. I have gone back and forward on this one a lot. So prior to this rewatch, in the back of my mind, I was like, this one is going to go on the list. This is the hidden gem of the noughties. And this is not a masterpiece by any stretch, but it could comfortably fit into the Renaissance. As you say, it's certainly the most Renaissance-feeling film we've had for, well, since Tarzan, and that we're going to get for a number of years as well. Then when I rewatched it, I felt quite bored. I found the first act boring and the second act fine. The third act, I think, is strong. And I came out of it just feeling a bit blah. And I wonder if part of that is because the first time I watched this film, I think the directions it takes are genuinely interesting. First time I watched it, I was like, okay, so he has to help this bear find its mother because to compensate for the fact that he killed another bear. And then it goes in other directions and their relationship changes and grows. And as I say, I think the twist at the end of he's going to remain in that position is unexpected. So I think knowing all that stuff was coming made me less invested in the film because I was less interested in where it was going because I knew where it was going. Which is less true of a lot of other films because I watch Beauty and the Beast. You know that Belle and Beast are going to end up together and something bad's going to happen to Gaston, right? Because that's just how those narratives go. As we talked through it, I've been like, there's some really strong stuff in this film. I don't care for the music. I think visually it's fine, and it's not an ugly film, but I wouldn't say it's a beautiful film either. And I think that's a real missed opportunity here because I personally find this setting so inspiring. This sort of these frozen North American forests, I think they're gorgeous. At the end of the day, I praised the first act of The Rescuers Down Under. I said this is really solid, but then the rest of the film lets it down. I feel this has the reverse problem. The final act is incredibly strong. The rest of it is a bit meh. I've talked about some of the ways I think they could have addressed that, and if the visuals were stunning and the music was great, or there were some better comedy sequences, again, I just don't care for the moose that much. Maybe that would offset some of that other stuff, but as is, I think it just falls short, so for me it's also a no.
Interestingly, this is probably the first film where I feel it's really close. I feel the problems with the script could have been resolved with just another couple to 6 months of really hashing it out and clarifying things without hammering us over the head. Maybe focus more on that toxic masculinity they deal with at the start and celebrate love as opposed to this vague kind of you feel guilt for what you did, which is ultimately what it ends up being. Change the songs, go back to the recording studio and come up with better songs. I think that's a fairly reasonable request, but it's not far off for me. It really could have gone on the list, but it hasn't, and with that, we return the list once more to the vault, and don't worry, I am doubly locking it to make sure nobody touches it in the next 4 weeks.
But of course, those are just our opinions. Where do you fall on Brother Bear? Do you feel it is worthy of making the list and we're being unfair of its shortcomings, or maybe you disagree about what its shortcomings are? Or are you on the side of me and Liam where this doesn't quite stretch over there? Is it a hidden gem, or is it quite rightly buried in the weird miasma of noughties Disney? And speaking of the miasma of noughties Disney, Liam, which film are we looking at next week?
Well, I hope you like strung together plots entirely devised based off the title to a single folk song, because next week we are looking at the animated classic, I'll remind you, of Home on the Range.
I am so ready to bust a moo. That's the tagline.
Yeah, for all of your complaints about the tagline of Brother Bear, I don't think it has anything on Buster Moo. And with that, all that's left to say is thank you very much for listening, wherever you choose to do so. Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics is available to listen on Spotify and SoundCloud, as well as the special enhanced version on YouTube, along with other Disney-related content and edits that we put out there. So if you're watching along with us, remember to give Home on the Range a watch for next time. We're doing it. I'm sure you can manage it too. And thank you once again for listening to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.
Here come the bears.
Here come the bears.
Here come the bears.